we can't caricaturize this whole culture. We can't say they were cold and dark, and we are fighting that with the warmth and the light of the menorah. It's more subtle. And now I'm going to try and characterize what really was, to try to pinpoint what really was the problem with both Greek philosophy and Greek mythology or culture.
This video was made possible through the kind support of my sponsors over at Patreon. Patreon is a great way to help independent creators like myself produce original content. If you'd like to get more English language videos from me, please consider becoming a supporter via Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you very much.
Hanukkah is a very special holiday in the sense that it's the one that the most grew out of history rather than being commanded from above. We have the biblical festivals, and they take place over the summer and a little bit going into the autumn. And that's Passover and Shavuot, Festival of Weeks, and then Sukkot, which is end of summer, beginning of autumn. And then from the Bible's perspective, we have the winter is devoid of holidays. But the winter is the time in which God is, so to speak, covering his face a little bit. He's making room for the world to grow and to be. And then things happen, events happen, and they grow from the darkness of this world, from the human activities, human interactions, and conflicts, and resolving of conflicts. And then first we got Purim. Purim was during the time at the end of the Babylonian exile, and it was just in time to make it into the Bible. It's not part of the God-given Torah commandments, but it was there just in time to be put into the Bible. There was actually a dispute whether the scroll of Esther should be included or not, but it ended up being included and it's kind of internal holiday. Hanukkah came even later with the conflict with the Greeks, and it was after the Bible was canonized, was sealed, and so it's not mentioned at all in the Bible because it comes later. But just like Purim, it's a holiday in which the conflict and the resolution of the conflict were so significant, then it was unanimous with Jews that it needs to be marked as a holiday. And so we have Purim and Hanukkah as two holidays that are historical. And of course, we also see them as being divinely ordained, but in a different way. They're not directly, explicitly commanded from God as in an above to below process or a light. It's called a straight light. A straight light is a light that comes straight, directly from God, from the heaven to the earth. But rather, it's a returning light type of holiday, these two holidays. They come from the human interaction, human activity. They grow out of the world, but it is also a divine light. That's the Jewish perspective, that the God speaks to us in two ways. He speaks from above, and he speaks from below, from within history. And so we have Purim with Hanukkah. And what is the similarity is that these are two wars and conflicts and threats. Judaism was threatened by Haman under the rule of Ahasuerus in the Persian Empire, and it was also under the threat of the Greek kingdom, the Greek occupation. But it's two different types of danger, and the miracle of surviving is also a different kind of miracle. In Purim, the physical existence of the Jewish people was threatened. We faced the danger of actual physical annihilation, very similar to later on what happened with the Nazis. The Nazis, in fact, Hitler saw himself explicitly as a kind of reincarnation of Haman. He said, everything that's going on here is we're going to make what Haman did. Now we're going to make it work, and if they succeed, they're going to have another Purim. He actually said that. With Hanukkah, it's a different story. Hanukkah, there was no threat of physical annihilation. There was no danger no actual persecution of Jews with the attempt of wiping out the Jewish people. That wasn't the Greek way at all. What they wanted was to exterminate Jewish religion and the Jewish faith and belief system and values. It's not as if they wanted to even erase the Bible. In fact, they wanted to translate the Bible into Greek, but they wanted to translate it in such a way that it takes away all the, what makes it special. And everything that makes it unique. They wanted to turn it into Jewish philosophy. We have Greek philosophy, there's Jewish philosophy. If you turn it into philosophy, it becomes dead, basically. It becomes some book of wisdom. It doesn't obligate you in any way. So what we're celebrating on Hanukkah, and the way we want to also connect to Hanukkah in a modern way, is that today also we have these two threats. There's one threat, there's one culture. Once again, it's coming from modern day Persia, which is Iran, which wants to physically, actually annihilate the Jewish people. And that, maybe we can talk about that in Purim. But there's another more subtle threat or conflict, which is the conflict to say that there's nothing really unique or obligating or objective about the Torah. If you say that it's just a cultural thing, it's the culture of the Jews, they have this cultural hobby, that's okay. But if you want to say there's a truth value to the Torah and that there's something really transcendent and holy and obligating about it, and something that is at odds with common sense maybe, or with what liberal culture would have you say is normal and positive and ethical, that we refuse to have. And that is a subtler threat because it can even sound as if it's not anti-Semitic at all. It's saying we love Jews, we love the Jewish people as long as they don't try to be too Jewish. We like them if they're normal Jews, i.e. westernized Jews, or those who totally accept Western values and culture. But we actually have in the Torah a kind of radical alternative to many of the aspects of Western culture. And silencing that, or even reaching a degree in which we ourselves not aware of the fact that we have this, that is a form of modern Hellenization, right? It's no longer called Hellenistic culture, it's called modern Western culture. But if you become so Western that you lose sight of the divine essence and value and the spark of what the Torah is all about, then you've become sort of Hellenized, even if you're not totally aware of it. So that's really the fight here. It's more subtle, it's more complicated, and we'll see as we go a little bit more into what's the difference between Greek culture and Judaism. We'll see just how subtle it is, because we're not going to push away Greek culture with both our hands. We're going to try and clarify and see the good from the bad within this culture. But we'll start with something really small, because it's not just, again, it's not philosophy. Hanukkah, it's a practical holiday. It has a practical element. We light candles every night. We come to the menorah and we light a candle, and the mitzvah, the essence of the mitzvah is just one candle. But the way we do it is we go further beyond the letter of the law, and we light one candle on the first day, and then we add a second candle, and every day there's more and more candles. And as the 8 days progress, two things increase. The first thing that increases is light. There's more and more light, and every evening we feel this. And in the 8th evening, there's all the 8 lights are burning, the 8 candles, and there's more and more light. So we add light at the time when, in the northern hemisphere, which is where Eretz Israel is, the land of Israel, it's winter. So the nights are long and dark, and so we add light to sort of counteract the actual physical, natural darkness of the world, and also the spiritual darkness which may engulf us. But another thing increases, and that is warmth. You don't feel it so much on the first day. You do see the light. The warmth is very subtle. But as the days advance and the candles are added, and at the 8th day you really feel it, there's real physical, palpable warmth that's coming out of the menorah. Of course, that's what fire does. Fire gives you light. Fire gives you warmth. That's everything that fire is all about ever since time immemorial. So today what we want to do is we want to meditate very profoundly, as profoundly as we can in the hour that we have, on the nature of light and the nature of warmth. And what do they fight? They fight darkness and they fight coldness. And of course, it's all spiritual. So we're not just talking about surviving in the world. To survive in the world, in the winter, you need warmth, you need light. That's obvious. We want to go into spiritual darkness and spiritual coldness. And that's what we want to sort of battle here and confront here. And in many ways, we can even say that the coldness is worse than no one has died from darkness, but you can die from coldness. You can freeze to death. It's never too dark that you can't survive in the darkness, but it can be too cold. And so it's two different things. And so we'll start with a very basic characterization of what they mean. If you can just mute the phone, please. So very generally speaking, we can say that light as an image, as a metaphor, is in itself more spiritual. Both of them can be physical or spiritual, but out of the two, light versus darkness is universally used as a spiritual metaphor. Darkness is not knowing and not knowing your way and not being able to differentiate maybe good from bad or right from wrong or forward from backward and not knowing what's going on. It's about knowledge. It's about wisdom or the lack of wisdom in the case of darkness, and the light is wisdom and being able to know. Knowing is being enlightened, is when you know something and you make my in Hebrew we say oru einai, my eyes are lit up when you understand something. It says it enlightens me, it lights up my eyes. So light has to do with the eyes, more broadly speaking with the head, with the intellect. So it's relatively speaking a more cerebral thing. It's more intellectual, cerebral, it's on the level of the head. We see with our eyes. And sometimes even in Hebrew, when we say that someone speaks, there's sort of light coming out of his mouth. Open your mouth and may your words enlighten us, light us up. So we both project light with our speech and we absorb light through our eyes and our ears because it's speech. So the whole thing revolves around our head. Warmth is not so intellectual or cerebral, it's more emotional. And we feel warmth in our bodies, not so much in our face. And we feel warmth in our heart. Our heart actually generates warmth. It pumps blood into the body, keeps the body active, and then the body becomes warm. And if someone becomes like a stranger to us, we feel a cold shoulder. And if someone is kind to us, we feel a feeling of warmth. So in many ways, Hanukkah has both these elements. And the thing about Hanukkah, what we want to experience over the days of Hanukkah, is that we want to become more knowledgeable, more enlightened, more connected to true wisdom and true faith, and have our minds be cleared. And also, we want to experience warmth, an increasing sense of warmth. Maybe of belonging, maybe of being really connected to our own hearts, to the hearts of others. And Hanukkah is about both things, which means also that the conflict with Greek culture has both these elements, which we'll go into in a minute. But before that, just one more thing. There were two miracles that we celebrate on Hanukkah. And one of them is a more spiritual miracle, and the other one is a more physical miracle. And they have to do with light versus warmth. The spiritual miracle, which is the one that's mentioned in the Talmud, that has the focus in the Talmud, is the miracle of the cruse of oil, the little flask of oil. When the Greeks came to the Holy Temple, they defiled all the holy oils. The oils, there was a special process of producing the oils, of guarding the oils, and it had to be guarded in a certain way so that it's not defiled in any way. They just opened them, poured them. Just by opening them, they become impure. But it turns out when the Jews reconquered the temple, and they searched and they were dismayed to see that all the oils have been defiled, they suddenly found a tiny little cruse of oil. that was unnoticed. It was sort of went under the radar of the Greeks. They didn't catch it. And in fact, it was the most holy one. It was sealed with the seal of the grand priest. And of course, it's very symbolic of, like, let's say, a Jewish secret that's so subtle that the Greeks didn't even notice it. It was too small for them. There was something crude maybe about the way they behaved and the way they came to the temple. They saw the big flasks of oil. They didn't notice the small one, the little one, which is also the holiest one. But it seemed to be enough to light the menorah for just one day. And it takes 8 days to reproduce oil to light the menorah. The menorah has to be lit every day. And then miraculously, it was enough for 8 days. That was the spiritual miracle. It's a supernatural miracle, because the physical amount of oil was just for one day. So it has to do with light, because it's the oil for the menorah which gives us light. And it has to do with something supernatural that is more spiritual, more connected to the head in relation to the body. Because it was physically impossible for the flask to produce oil for so many days. So we don't know if it was slow to burn, or it just multiplied, or it was little for each day. If you want to go into the details, you can explain it in many ways, but the bottom line was that it was enough for the 8 days. That's the spiritual miracle. Then there's another miracle. The other miracle is not mentioned in the Talmud, but it is mentioned in the prayer. When we say the prayer, when we add the blessing for Hanukkah in the prayers, we do mention that. We don't mention the flask of oil. We mention another miracle. The other miracle was that we were few against many. Very different kind of miracle. It's not a supernatural miracle. It's a question of odds. The odds were against us. It has happened in history, but it's rare. It goes against the statistics. So it's a very different kind of miracle. It's not a total, it's not a unanimous agreement. It's a miracle in the sense that God intervened. On the other hand, you cannot ignore it. Same thing happened in the 6-day war. We didn't see God's hand literally, physically come into the world. But the fact that we were such a tiny army facing several armies in such a short span of time was something that many people were easy to say that this was miraculous. This was beyond the norm. It doesn't make any sense. It was the same with the Hanukkah war. The Greeks were greater in number and greater in strength, and the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, were fewer in number, smaller in strength, they had less strength, and they were able to beat the war. So that is not mentioned in the Talmud. It's mentioned in the prayers. It's not a supernatural miracle. It's what we call a natural miracle, or a miracle that's embodied within nature. It can be seen as not a miracle necessarily. And it has to do with warmth. Why? Because in a sense, war is about warmth. It's interesting that the English word warmth begins with war. I didn't notice that until now. But in Hebrew also, milchama is war. And within milchama you have cham. Cham is the root of chom, warmth. So very interesting. Never noticed until now that both in English and in Hebrew, and it's maybe interesting to look at some other languages, the word in Hebrew, the word war contains warmth. In English, the word warmth contains war. But either way, we see the connection. And in a way, you can say that what enabled the Jews to win the war was that they had a lot of camaraderie, a lot of warmth, that their heart was alive. Maybe the Greeks, their heart weren't so into the war. They weren't fighting for their lives. They had a big empire. There was just one province in the empire. For Jews, we were defending our holy temple. That's all we have. So the warmth was greater, and it was through the warmth that the war was won. But we see, so we sort of mapped here the two levels and aspects of Hanukkah. So it's just a basic thing. Going into Hanukkah, we have these two levels. And we can also say another thing, the fact that the Talmud, which is part of the Torah, which is relatively speaking an intellectual process. You learn the Torah with your head. You have to look into the Torah, you have to understand the Torah. It's a more intellectual thing. It's also emotional, but it's first and foremost intellectual. That talks about the spiritual miracle, has to do with the oil, has to do with the light, has to do with vision, with the head. Whereas praying, which is where we mentioned the war, praying is a bit like a battle. You're fighting your own. It's not intellectual, it's an emotional process. You're using your heart. You have to pray with your heart. It's coming out of your heart. You don't need to use your head so much. When you're praying, the main thing is that your heart is in the right place and you have the kavanah, the intention. So, even more beautiful, right? Understanding Hanukkah in this way and seeing the two levels. Okay, so now we want to understand, so what does this have to do with Greek culture? Because we're saying the battle is not over who's really controlling the land. That's part of the deal. It's not the main deal. And the war is not against people trying to annihilate us. It's about people trying to Hellenize us, to make us lose our culture. So what was it about Greek culture that the light and the warmth of the menorah is fighting or going up against? So we can say, well, so Greek culture, it didn't have light. It had darkness. It was a dark culture. Or we can say it was a cold culture. It was a dark and cold culture, and we needed to confront it with a light of light and light of warmth. And we do have sources saying that. We have sources that Greek culture darkened our eyes. We had to light up our eyes. And maybe people can argue that there was something cold, calculated maybe about Greek culture. But if people know and love Greek culture, they would take an issue with this. And they would say there's no light in Greek culture, there's no warmth in Greek culture. Of course there is. Because Greek culture also has two basic levels to it, two basic pillars. One pillar is Greek philosophy. Greek philosophy is the foundation of all Western science, mathematics, biology, physics, astronomy, and philosophy itself, just understanding concepts and thinking deeply about concepts. And that doesn't have light. It has a tremendous amount of light. There's so much light in Greek philosophy. If you study Plato, you study Aristotle, there were wise. They fought the darkness of ignorance. They fought the darkness of maybe being motivated by power. They wanted people to be motivated by the pursuit of truth, and they were very honest about this. And you shouldn't make fun of them. And Jewish philosophers took them very seriously. Like Maimonides, the prime example of someone who actually took elements from the Aristotelian philosophy and put it into not just the Guide to the Perplexed, his philosophical work, but also into the Mishneh Torah, his halachic treatise. He also put in the beginning, he put something from Aristotle. So he didn't treat them as unenlightened or a dark culture. He saw the intellectual light of Greek philosophy. What about the warmth? So that goes into the second pillar of Greek culture, that has to do with the mythology, which then evolved into Greek theater and art, which all revolves around Greek mythology. The philosophy doesn't really talk about the mythology. They saw themselves as above the mythology. They saw actually the myth as outdated, the philosophers. They would humor them, they humored the gods, but they didn't really hold by that. And but the mass, the culture of the masses, was very much around the mythology and the idol worship. When you said idol worship, that's completely forbidden. Yes, but then it became abstracted into Greek art and theater, which wasn't so much about the gods. It was more about the human drama and the human interaction and psychology, and that had a lot of warmth. People are moved to this day by Greek tragedies and Greek art and sculpture, architecture. So, like I said in the beginning, everything here is more subtle. We can't caricaturize this whole culture. We can't say they were cold and dark, and we are fighting that with the warmth and the light of the menorah. It's more subtle. And now I'm going to try and characterize what really was, to try to pinpoint what really was the problem with both Greek philosophy and Greek mythology or culture. And it's going to be very sketchy because it's one class. We need to dedicate a whole seminar. But I'm going to try and pinpoint the thing. The light of Greek philosophy, there was light there, a great intellectual light. But the light was a cold light. The light and the warmth, they didn't connect enough. It was a cold, rational kind of light, as opposed to a warm light. I'll explain in a minute what that means. And the warmth of Greek mythology and subsequently culture, there was a lot of warmth. But there was something dark about that warmth. So you see, the light and the warmth, they need to integrate. It's not enough having a lot of intellectual, philosophical light and a lot of cultural, emotional, psychological, human warmth. If the two are disconnected, and my argument is that in Greek culture there was a very powerful disconnect. And there's a very well-known historical incident in which that disconnect, that conflict between the culture of the masses, which revolved around mythology, and the philosophy of the elites, which was around their philosophy, the moment they came into conflict more than any other moment was when the masses executed their biggest philosopher, whose name was Socrates. And that caused the philosophers to be even more arrogant in regards to the masses. And Plato, who was the student of Socrates, was so angry by the people, by the fact that the democracy, with the democratic election, executed his master. He was anti-democracy. He favored a dictatorship. He said the masses cannot rule themselves. They don't know anything. They executed their biggest teacher that they ever had. You need a philosopher king. That's what he said. The disconnect was very, very hard. There was a famous play by one of their comedic playwrights. Maybe later I'll remember his name. It was called Clouds. It was all about making fun of Socrates, even before he was executed. Maybe it paved the way to the vote that he should be executed. There was a very strong disconnect. And if you go into the philosophers, they mock the religion of the masses. And they say they should be censored. And people should grow out of it. And that it corrupts you morally. Greek mythology. And the people who were around the mythology, like the playwrights, again, like in that play, they mocked the philosophers. And what you ended up having a lot of intellectual light in the philosophy, but it didn't integrate with the warmth, because they were at odds. And it was very cold. And the warmth of the culture and of the mythology had disdain for the intellectual light. And so there was something dark about it. So now let's explain a little bit more. What makes Greek philosophy and the intellectual light of Greek philosophy cold? So it's very simple. They only hold by the principle of abstraction. They want to abstract everything, and they have very low regard for the body and emotions. For most Greek philosophers, the emotions they only get in the way of the intellectual wisdom. You need to transcend the emotions, even the most basic human emotions. When Socrates swallowed the poison that he was obeyed to do, then just before that he sits with all his students and he convinces them, he proves to them that the soul is eternal, and while the body dies, the soul lives on. Then he swallows the poison. There's a few more minutes before he passes away. He dies. And then the students start crying. The most natural, obvious human feeling. They're about to lose their teacher. And then he rebukes them. He's angry. Why are you crying? Are you women? That's what he says. Are you like women? Like little kids? Why? I just proved to you that just my body is going to die. My soul is going to live. Who cares about the body? The body is nothing. The body is a prison. That's what he says. And they're crying because they want a soul within a body. They're human. They're normal. But he's telling them it's not normal to be human. You have to be cold. You have to be rational. Totally rational. The only feelings you're allowed to have are intellectual feelings. You need to love the ideas, the philosophical ideas. Love wisdom. Philosophy is loving wisdom. There was an emotion there, but it was totally intellectual emotion. But human emotion, valuing the transient, the body, the feelings, that is childish or effeminate, and you need to transcend it, completely transcend it. And you need to be you can only love the soul, never love the body. That's Platonic love. That's the whole point, the whole idea of Platonic love. So the wisdom, there was a lot of light in the wisdom. It was very rational. That was another example, different example, is that they couldn't stand paradoxes. They were very good in discovering paradoxes. They discovered, for example, the irrational numbers, but they couldn't stand them. And there was one Greek mathematician who discovered the irrational numbers, and he spoke about them, and then he ended up drowning. And they said this was a punishment from the gods, that he revealed the notion of irrational numbers, because nothing must be irrational. And if there is something irrational, we have to cover it up in some way. So there was a light, but it was cold. It was very rational. They couldn't bear the super-rational, or the trans-rational, the paradoxical, and also the sub-rational, the human, the emotional. Again, they only had room for a certain type of emotion, which was intellectual emotion, love of wisdom, love of abstract beauty of mathematics, and so on. But that's a very particular kind of cerebral emotion. It's still very cold. Now, what about the warmth of mythology and the culture? So there was a lot of warmth. If you read the Greek tragedies, they were very eloquent, and they described the human condition, the human emotion, fears, loves, the tragedies. Unbelievable, amazing literature. But there's something dark about it. Why is there something dark about it? Because it's ultimately, the worldview is tragic. It was no coincidence that the serious plays were all tragedies, and the comedies that have a happy ending, they were for the masses, they were entertainment, that was Hollywood. But a serious play has to be tragic. Why? Because reality is totally tragic. There's no divine justice, there's this blind fate. And ultimately, if you try to defy fate, fate is going to win, you're going to lose. And so every great soul with a great mission, with a great vision, is going to lose. So the world, the outlook, the worldview, is that the world is a dark place. It's a terrible place. There's no kind creator that promises you a happy ending. So you had tragedies for the elite, and you had comedies for the masses. And there was no, what later was called, in Christianity, a divine comedy. That was Dante. But he was coming out of Christianity, which is coming out of the Bible. He said the Bible is an alternative. There was a wise thing to say. But that's coming out of Christianity, which is coming out of Judaism, which is that the biblical worldview is a divine comedy. Comedy in the sense that it has a happy ending, a good ending. Salvation, redemption. You end up in paradise. If you repent, you go up to paradise. So the idea of a divine comedy starts with the Bible, basically, that we can have a great soul like Abraham, who's defying fate, but it doesn't end up in tragedy. It ends up changing the world for the better, bringing monotheism, bringing justice, bringing the Torah to the world. Jews, and what the Judaism and what the menorah stands for, the light and the warmth are totally, you can't separate them. You light up the candle and it emits both light and warmth. Why? Because we want to have warm light and unlightened warmth. We want to study Torah, but it's not cool, cold, rational philosophy. It's a warm philosophy. It's a philosophy that makes room for emotions, makes room for the human condition. It tells you the body is a wonderful thing. You need to sanctify it. You don't transcend it. You don't throw it away. In the end of the days, you want to come back to your body, the reincarnation of the dead. We love the body. We want to rectify it. We want to make sure it's holy. But we love the body. And there's room for emotions. And there's room for tears. You can try. It's not called effeminate. It's not called childish. It's not called... The Jewish rabbis, the sages, they cry all the time. There's so many stories about rabbis crying. It's the most profound moments is when they cry. When the wisdom touches their heart. And it's not just the love of wisdom. It's the love of God, but God is a personal God. It's not just a logos, a cold entity, which is a mathematician or the architect of the universe. He's a personal creator, and he wants a personal connection with you. So it's a philosophy, it's a wisdom, it's a Torah, but it's very warm. And the warmth, that is the stories and our mythology, so to speak, the biblical stories, the rabbinic stories, they're all about connecting to the light of faith and the light of God. They're not cold. They don't have this coldness. You don't live in a cold world when you're reading the rabbinical stories or biblical stories. There's sometimes very hard things going on in the world. It's very realistic. Not everything is rosy. Some things are very tough. But ultimately, there's a creator. There's a guardian. There's hope. There's promise. It's a world that's warm. It's a world that has hope. It's hopeful. Judaism is hopeful. So the stories are warmth, but the warmth is, again, it's enlightened. I said a warm world, I mean it's an enlightened world. There's light coming from heaven into the stories, which makes the warmth an enlightened warmth. So the intellectual aspect of Judaism has warmth to it, and the emotional aspect of Judaism has light to it, because there's always light at the end of the tunnel. So I think there's so much more to be said about all this. But I think, for me, that changed everything about Hanukkah. Because I was studying Greek philosophy and Greek culture in university before I discovered Judaism seriously. And so no one could fool me and tell me that Greek culture was totally superficial or totally ridiculous or totally cold or totally whatever. It didn't work. I had to sort it out myself. I had to find rabbis who also knew a little bit about Greek culture and could relate and could tell me, of course, it's maybe people who don't know this so much, then they can caricaturize the Greek culture. But if you know it, on the other hand, we're not saying, well, all cultures have good things about them, bad things about them, to be polite and political. And political is being polite. It's the same thing. And to say, things that are politically correct, all cultures have good or bad about. No. It's because the claim of Hanukkah is a bit more radical. The claim of Hanukkah is that there was something in Greek culture that was coming to some dead end. And it wanted to bring the whole world under their own culture, but the fact that they were at odds with themselves, the philosophers, with the playwrights, and all this, means that there was something inherently negative there. With all the good that was there was something inherently negative. It was it brought light, the philosophical, scientific light, and it brought the warmth, but the way they integrated was not working. And Judaism is trying to bring another model, as to how to work with philosophy and with culture. A culture that's about tragedies, it builds a cold world. And a philosophy that's about only intellect, not emotional, sorry, I meant to say, it's a dark world. The culture that's about tragedy, it's warm in the sense there's a lot of emotion going on, and you're moved to tears by the literature but it's you paint the picture of a very dark, meaningless, senseless world, a tragic world. And a philosophy that is very intellectual but not warm, that gives you a very cold world. And in fact, when you look at culture advancing, Western culture today is not just a product of Greek philosophy and culture, it's also a product of Christianity, which is, we can say, a kind of branch of coming out of Judaism. And in that sense, it has become far more integrated. It's not as simple as it was back in Greek times. Thinkers today, great thinkers today, most of them are not just cold and rational. Some of them are, but many of them, they have much more warmth to their writing because they try to connect the intellectual with the human. That is a consequence of the Bible having such an imprint on Western culture. And also you can see attempts that's slower to grow, I would say, of having sophisticated cultural novels and movies and plays that are still optimistic. That's slower to happen because to this day, some of the greatest work of art, they have a tragic tinge to them, which goes to show that tragedies takes slower to sort of die out, as the word. Okay, now one final thing. How many candles do we light all throughout, from beginning to end? 1 + 2 + 3 up until 8. Not 42.
44.
Not 44. 44 is when you buy the candles, you have 44 because they also give you the 8 shamashim, the extra candles you use to light. That's not part of the mitzvah.
36.
So it would be 36. 36 candles, all in all. 1 plus 2 plus 3, up until 8, 36 candles. The number 36 in Judaism, something immediately comes to mind. What are this? Tzadikim. Lamed Vav Tzadikim, 36, every generation, so it says, somewhere all over the world, there are 36 tzaddikim, righteous Jews who are in some other level of righteousness, and they need to be found. Maybe they're hidden, maybe they're revealed. Every generation has Lamed Vav Tzaddikim, 36 tzaddikim. There's another lesser known association of 36 regarding human figures. Just like we have 36 tzaddikim, there's another 36 type of person, but it's not so well known. In the book of Samuel, second book of Samuel, that's all about David, there's a list of David's heroes, giborim. He has 36 heroes. And they're actual fighters. Later on, it's told of Solomon, his son, that he had 60 giborim that were around his bed guarding him when he went to sleep. But that was more representative. They weren't actual fighters. And because there was no war in the time of Solomon. Solomon is Shlomo. It has to do with peace. Everything was peaceful. Why? Because David did all the wars for him, his father. He inherited a peaceful kingdom. David was a fighter, and he had 36 champions or heroes, giborim. So you have 36 tzaddikim, righteous Jews, righteous people, and you have 36 heroes. And clearly, they correspond. You can say that when we're lighting the candles, every day we'll add a candle, it's another tzaddik. And that we focus, when we think about the tzaddik, we focus on the light. The light enlightens us spiritually, intellectually, in terms of wisdom, in terms of serving God. It's something very spiritual. So the 36 sources of light, the candles as sources of light, that would be the 36 tzaddikim. But in as much as the candles are sources of warmth, then the 36 candles would align or correspond to the 36 giborim of David. Now again, we want to integrate them. Now something interesting happened over the course of Jewish history, and it reached a kind of peak in modern Israeli history, which is that throughout most of history, Jews had less and less of giborim, of champions, warriors, because we were in exile. We didn't fight wars. And it was all Jewish culture was around the tzaddikim. If you go back to the stories, all the stories about tzaddikim, this tzaddik and that tzaddik, and the miracles he performed, and the miracles, the wisdom, and the amazing wisdom, and the unbelievable wisdom, and it's all about the tzaddikim stories. At some point, the first Zionists, the Jews were all about going out of the exile, coming out of the exile, going up to Eretz Yisrael, conquering the land, fighting, going back to becoming physical, not just being spiritual, intellectual in exile. They hated the tzaddikim stories. We had enough of tzaddikim, no more tzaddikim. What we need now are heroes. They went back and they took, Yehuda Maccabi, right, from Hanukkah, Bar Kochva, right? Bar Kochva, he was no big deal. There's no tradition so much about Bar Kochva. He was like, he was a failure, basically. He was seen as, but the Zionists turned him into a big hero. And they made all Lag BaOmer about Bar Kochva. And then look at modern Israeli secular culture. Everyone loves Giborim. And then they go to the superheroes. Giborim are heroes. So they go to the superheroes of the Greek, basically. All the modern superheroes are reincarnations of Greek gods in a modern guise. In a modern, they put a Superman and Batman and Spider-Man. They're all really like the Greek gods. So when you grow up in Israeli, first you have the Jewish heroes. You have like Shimshon, Samson, the hero. And then they're boring, and after some time they're boring, you go to the Greek heroes. And whereas the religious, especially the ultra-Orthodox, they want nothing to do with those heroes. And they still only read the tzaddikim stories. We want to integrate everyone. Right? That's the main thing we should have in mind. We don't like the tribes mentality of Israeli culture. We want to integrate, and we think that everyone, each one of the tribes, each one of the groups, they touch something that's very true, but it's one element of the truth. It's partial. We want the whole truth about what Judaism is all about, and it turns out that we want people who are both tzaddikim and giborim. They both have the light, the spiritual light of the righteous, and they have the warmth and the courage and the bravery of the heroes, the giborim. And it's the same candles. It's 36 candles. It's not 72. It's 36 candles, which have both light and warmth to them. And now comes the unbelievable thing. If you take the word Chashmona'i, right, because our heroes, or righteous Jews, because they were both, the Maccabees, which their real name was Chashmonaim. You take the word Chashmona'i in the singular, Chashmona'i, and you do the gematria, the numerical value is exactly the sum of tzaddik plus gibor. Tzaddik plus gibor. Of course, I didn't discover this, it was Rabbi Ginsburg, because he's thinking in numbers, thinking in mathematics, in numbers and letters, because it's all together for him. I think this is just an amazing revelation. But it's not just this numerological discovery. It's far more profound. Because the fact that Chashmona'i equals tzaddik, righteous, plus gibor, hero or champion, is true about the Chashmonaim. They were priests. They were in the temple. They were all about lighting the menorah. They were about studying. They were spiritual people. But when the time came, they went out and became heroes and became fighters. They were really both. And that we are aspiring in Hanukkah that the 36 candles would be both spiritual tzaddikim, just like we had for 2,000 years, with all the stories, beautiful stories, people who would daven, who learned Torah all day, were very spiritual, but we also want the same people, us, our children, to be heroes, to be connected to their bodies, to have the warmth and the courage and the emotion and the camaraderie and the connection and the humanity of the heroes. And that's the ideal Jew. It's no coincidence that Hanukkah is the last holiday in history to make it into the Jewish calendar. And you can say Yutet Kislev really came at the very end, instead of it's becoming more and more of an all-Jewish holiday. Every year it's becoming bigger. But Hanukkah, and in many ways, Yutet Kislev Chassidut is a continuation of Hanukkah. It's coming a little bit before it, because it becomes a preparation for Hanukkah. But Chassidut is all about integrating those two levels, not having them be two distinct levels. So I think this is a beautiful way of understanding Hanukkah, of connecting to Hanukkah. And it can also be our kavanah going into Hanukkah in a few days, lighting the candles each day. We can actually experience very palpably. And again, it's not theory, it's something really, and that could be the way we connect to the candles, is we look at the lights with our eyes, it enlightens us, and it makes us want to become more righteous, more connected to our souls, more connected to cleaving to God. And also, more and more every day, we feel the warmth, the human warmth of loving our fellow Jews, loving fellow humans, wanting to bring all the joy and the warmth and the happiness of Hanukkah and the holiday of coming together. And in recent years, with Chabad, we started having menorahs in cities on the outside, so that the whole world, all these miracles, the spiritual and the physical, would be publicized, would be shared in the great big menorahs, so people would see the light, feel the warmth, and it would be all connected, all one. So that is our shir, our Get Ready for Hanukkah class for this year.
Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, please press like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. If you want more English language videos from me, please consider becoming a supporter via Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode.